The afternoon Susan Dawson was traded for water rights. The sky above Redemption Creek was the color of old bone, and she stood in the middle of her father's yard with her Sunday dress pressed clean, and her hands folded in front of her like she was attending her own funeral. She was 22 years old, and she had known for 3 days that this moment was coming. Her father, Hector Dawson, had told her on a Tuesday evening after supper, setting down his tin cup of coffee and clearing his throat the way he did before he delivered bad news, like a man testing ice before he committed his full weight to it. He had said that the Calhoun family, who owned the only functioning deep well in the valley for 60 miles in every direction, had offered him a deal. The Calhouns would redirect water rights to the Dawson land, enough water to save the cattle, enough water to save the crops, enough water to save the family from another year of grinding poverty, and in exchange, Hector Dawson would give his eldest daughter Susan to Eli Calhoun as a wife. Eli Calhoun was 41 years old. Susan had met him 3 times in her life. He had small eyes the color of dried mud and hands that were always slightly damp, and he had looked at her the second time they crossed paths at the general store in town like she was livestock he was considering purchasing. She had said nothing to her father when he told her. She had simply stood up from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the cracked and dusty earth that was her father's land, the earth that was slowly dying because the creek that used to run through it had been dammed upstream by the Calhoun family 2 seasons ago. She understood the mathematics of the situation, even if she despised every number in the equation. This was 1882. The territory of New Mexico was not yet a state, and in the dry basin country south of Santa Fe, water was not merely a commodity. Water was survival. Water was the difference between a family that lasted and a family that scattered to the wind like ash. Hector Dawson was not a cruel man. He was a desperate one, which Susan had come to understand was sometimes more dangerous than cruelty because desperation at least had a reason behind it. So she stood in the yard on that dry Thursday afternoon in the middle of July, and Eli Calhoun arrived in a wagon with his brother Deke riding alongside, and behind them came a rider Susan had not seen before. He was on a dark bay horse, and he sat in the saddle the way men who had spent half their lives on horseback tend to sit naturally, without effort, like the horse was simply an extension of himself. He wore a battered hat with a dark sweat stain at the band, a plain canvas shirt, and a leather vest. He had a badge on that vest, though Susan did not notice it immediately because she was too busy watching Eli Calhoun step down from the wagon and walk toward her father with the particular swagger of a man who believed the world owed him everything it had already given him. "Dawson," Eli said, extending a hand. "Good to see you came to your senses." Hector Dawson shook his hand and did not look at his daughter. The man with the badge had dismounted and tied his horse to the post near the fence. He came around the side of the wagon without being invited, which seemed to irritate Deke Calhoun considerably. He stopped a few feet from the group and folded his arms across his chest. "Eli," he said, and his voice was even and unhurried. "You want to tell me what exactly this arrangement involves, because from where I am standing, this looks like something I need to hear explained plainly." Eli Calhoun turned slowly. "Marshall," he said, and his tone shifted slightly, the swagger dialed back by about a quarter. "This is a private land matter. Family business. The young lady standing in that yard is not your family yet," the man said. "And I was told in town this morning that there was a water rights negotiation happening out here today that involved a person rather than property, which is the kind of thing that makes me ride out to take a look." Susan looked at the badge properly then. It read, "United States Deputy Marshal," and then she looked at the face beneath the hat brim. He was perhaps 30, maybe 32, with dark eyes and a jaw that had not been shaved in a few days. And there was something in the way he held himself that was different from any man she had encountered in this valley. He was not performing authority. He simply had it, the way some men carry confidence not as a costume but as a natural condition of their being. His name, she would learn within the next 10 minutes, was Marshall Carver. I did not ride 60 miles in this heat to watch a woman get handed over like a deed to a parcel of land, Marshall Carver said. He looked at Hector Dawson, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was absolutely direct. "Sir, is this your daughter?" Hector cleared his throat. "She is. And is she agreeable to this arrangement?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Hector looked at the ground. Eli made a small, impatient sound in the back of his throat. Susan lifted her chin. "I was not asked," she said clearly. Marshall Carver looked at her, then properly looked at her, and something passed across his face that she could not entirely name. It was not pity. She would have hated pity. It was something more like recognition, the look of a man who understood exactly the nature of what was happening here and found it profoundly wrong. "Eli Calhoun," he said, turning back to face the older man with those damp hands and dried mud eyes, "I am going to be straightforward with you because I do not have the patience for anything else today. You cannot trade a human being for water access. That is not a legal contract. That is not a binding agreement, and I will not allow it to proceed." Eli's face reddened. "You have no authority over private land deals, Marshall." "I have authority over anything that involves the coercion of a person," Marshall said, and his voice remained completely calm, which somehow made it more authoritative than if he had raised it. "And I have authority over the misuse of water rights as leverage in this territory, which is actually what brought me out here in the first place. Your father's dam upstream is not lawful. Your family redirected a natural waterway that feeds 5 properties, and you have been using the resulting desperation of your neighbors to extract things from them that you have no right to extract." Deke Calhoun spat on the ground. "You got a lot of nerve coming onto our arrangement, and Deke," Marshall said without looking at him, "I would suggest you let your brother handle this conversation." There was a beat of silence. Deke said nothing more. Eli Calhoun stared at the deputy marshal for a long moment, calculating something behind those dried mud eyes. Then he said, "And what do you propose?" "The water rights get restored to the Dawson land and the 4 other properties your family dammed out, through the proper territorial authority, which I intend to see to personally," Marshall said. "And Miss Dawson," he paused slightly on her name, though he had not yet been formally told it, which told Susan he had done his preparation before riding out here, "goes back to being a free woman who makes her own choices about her own future. The water question and the person are 2 entirely separate matters, and I am telling you right now that she is not part of any deal." The words hit her somewhere deep, somewhere she had not expected to be reached that afternoon. "She is not part of any deal." 7 words delivered in an even, certain voice by a man she had never met, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight since that Tuesday evening when her father had set down his coffee cup. Eli Calhoun left that afternoon without Susan and without his arrangement. He was furious, and he made sure everyone within hearing distance understood his fury, but Marshall Carver stood in the yard until the Calhoun wagon was dust on the horizon, and he did not move from that spot until he was certain they were gone. Hector Dawson sat down heavily on the porch steps and put his face in his hands. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been pushed past the edge of what he could endure by the slow killing of everything he had worked to build, and he had made a decision in desperation that he would have to live with regardless of whether it had come to pass. Susan looked at him for a long moment, and she felt the complicated mixture of love and anger that had defined her relationship with her father for most of her adult life. She turned to the deputy marshal. "Thank you," she said. He took off his hat. His hair was dark and slightly damp from the heat, and his eyes up close were not simply dark, but the particular deep brown of good soil after rain. "Marshall Carver," he said. "Deputy United States Marshal." "Susan Dawson," she replied. He put his hat back on. "The water matter is going to take some time to sort through the territorial office, but I want you to know I intend to see it through. Your family's land rights should have been protected from the start. What made you ride out here?" she asked. "You said in town someone told you, a woman at the general store," he said. "She told me what was being arranged, and she looked at me like she was hoping I might do something about it. I figured if I was in a position to do something about it, I ought to." He paused. "I am sorry I did not get here sooner. I am sorry this was something your father thought was his only option." She nodded, because she did not have the right words yet for everything she was feeling. He stayed for another hour, speaking with her father about the legal process for contesting the Calhoun Dam and what the territorial authority could compel the family to do. Hector Dawson listened with the defeated but gradually reviving expression of a man hearing that all was not yet lost. By the time Marshall Carver mounted his dark bay horse to ride back toward town, the sky had moved from bone white to a pale gold at the edges where the sun was beginning its descent. Susan watched him go from the porch. She told herself she was simply watching a man do his job. She told herself that gratitude and admiration were very different things from whatever she could feel forming at the back of her thoughts like weather gathering on the horizon. She was not entirely convincing. The following morning, Susan went to town. Redemption Creek was not a large settlement, perhaps 400 souls at its most generous count, spread along a main street of packed earth and weathered timber that contained a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Iron Spur, a small church whose paint was peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, a post office, and a small building that served as the territorial marshal's local office. Staffed usually by a single deputy when the nearest full marshal was occupied elsewhere in the vast sprawl of New Mexico territory. She told herself she was going for flour and a spool of thread. She even bought the flour and the thread, carrying the paper-wrapped parcels under one arm as she walked back down the main street in the morning heat. She told herself she was not looking for anything else, not watching the door of the marshal's office, not noting that the dark bay horse was tied to the rail outside it. She had made it almost to the corner when she heard him call her name. "Miss Dawson." She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the marshal's office, a piece of paper in one hand. He looked as though he had not slept particularly well, which gave him a slightly rumpled quality that, she noted despite herself, was not unappealing. "I was just about to send a note out to your place," he said. "I have a response from the territorial office about the Calhoun water matter. It is faster than I expected." She walked over. He held the door open for her, and she stepped into the small office, which smelled of paper, gun oil, and the particular dusty heat that built up in any enclosed space in the territory during July. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a rifle mounted on the wall, a set of wanted notices pinned to a board, and a small wood-burning stove that was obviously not in use given the temperature. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and he sat opposite her and unfolded the paper. "The territorial authority has already had the Calhoun Dam on record as a contested construction," he said. "2 of your neighbors, the Vargas family and the Hendersons, filed complaints last year that were never properly acted on. My report from yesterday, combined with those complaints, gives the office sufficient grounds to issue an order requiring the Calhouns to remove the dam obstruction and restore natural water flow to the downstream properties." He looked up from the paper. "It will take 3 to 4 weeks for the formal order to be processed and enforced, but this is happening. The water will come back." Susan felt something in her exhale that she had been holding for months. "My father's cattle, I know," he said. He pulled a second piece of paper toward him. "I am also submitting a request that the territorial authority investigate whether the Calhoun family owes the affected landowners compensation for the season's losses. I cannot promise what will come of that part, but I intend to make the argument." She looked at him across the desk. The morning light came through the single narrow window and fell across his hands where they rested on the papers. He was methodical and careful, she noticed. He handled the documents with attention, like details mattered to him in a way that was genuine rather than performed. "You did not have to do all of this," she said. He looked up. "I did actually. It is my job. Some people do their job and some people do their job," she said. He considered that for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "I have been told I take things too seriously." "By whom?" "By various people over the years who thought situations did not require as much attention as I was giving them." He paused. "I generally disagreed with those people." She found herself smiling at that, and noticed that he was watching her smile with an expression that was not quite as professionally neutral as it had been a moment before. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Yesterday when you said I was not part of any deal," she paused, gathering the words. "How did you know to say it that way, that exact way?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers on his desk and then looked back at her. "Because it needed to be said clearly," he said. "Not just to Eli Calhoun. Sometimes a person needs to hear that about themselves." He paused again. "That they are not a bargaining piece, that their value is not negotiable." She said nothing for several seconds. Then she said, "I am going to go now, before I say something I will feel embarrassed about later." He stood when she stood, which she noted. Good manners were not universal in Redemption Creek. "Miss Dawson," he said. She stopped at the door. "I will be in this territory for the next few weeks while the water matter processes. If you need anything, if the Calhouns give your family any difficulty, I want you to come here and tell me." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I will," she said. She meant it. She was back 2 days later, but not because of the Calhouns. She came because her neighbor, a Mexican woman named Rosaria Vargas, who had been one of the complainants against the Calhoun Dam, had asked her to bring a document to the marshal's office on her behalf, since Rosaria did not speak much English and was reluctant to navigate official correspondence on her own. Susan, who had grown up alongside Rosaria's children and spoke enough Spanish to carry a reasonable conversation, had agreed without hesitation. Marshall was at his desk when she arrived, and this time there was a second man in the office, another deputy, passing through on his way to a property dispute further south, and the conversation was businesslike and practical and lasted 20 minutes. But when the other deputy excused himself to see to his horse, Marshall and Susan stood for a moment in the comfortable quiet that can only exist between two people who are unexpectedly at ease with each other. "I noticed you brought the Vargas document yourself," he said. "Rosaria asked me." "I know, but you did not have to come personally. You could have sent her son." "I wanted to come," she said simply. He nodded, looking at the document she had brought, his pen tracing the relevant paragraph with a professional focus that she could tell was, in that particular moment, somewhat effortful. "Tell her I will have this processed by the end of the week," he said. "And tell her that her family's claim is legitimate and I'm including it in the formal order." "She will be relieved," Susan said. "The Vargas family has lost nearly as much as we have this past season. Rosaria's husband has been working at the mine to keep the family going. It has been hard on all of them." He looked up from the document. "It should not have come to this," he said, and there was a quiet firmness in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as something essential to his character. The refusal to pretend that injustice was simply the natural order of things. The territorial authority should have acted on those complaints months ago. People in this valley have been suffering because the right paperwork did not receive the attention it deserved. "Are you always this indignant on behalf of people you have just met?" she asked. He paused. "I suppose I am," he said. "My mother would say it is a character flaw." "What would you say?" "A beat." "I would say my mother and I have different opinions about what constitutes a flaw." She laughed then, genuinely, openly, the kind of laugh that surprised her by arriving before she was ready for it, and he looked startled for a moment, as though the sound had caught him off guard, and then he smiled, properly this time, and it changed his entire face. The professional gravity fell away briefly, and what was underneath was something considerably warmer, and Susan felt the warm tilt of that smile land somewhere in the center of her chest, like the first good rain after a dry season. She went home that Afternoon knowing that flower and thread had nothing to do with anything anymore. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them that Susan would later find impossible to describe precisely, but would remember always as one of the most vivid periods of her life, the kind of time that exists in a person's memory not as a sequence of events, but as a whole feeling, the way a piece of music sounds different once you know what it was written about. She found reasons to come to town. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this. She helped Rosaria navigate the official process. She brought her father's response documents to the marshal's office when they arrived. She delivered a message once for the local pastor, whose eyesight was failing and who appreciated having letters read to him. These were all genuine errands, genuinely done, but they were also arranged with a calculation that she would have been embarrassed to describe to anyone except possibly Rosaria, who noticed everything and said nothing, except to occasionally look at Susan with the particular small knowing smile of a woman who has been in love herself and recognizes the symptoms. Marshall, for his part, seemed to find reasons of his own. He rode out to the Dawson property twice on official business, once to deliver updated documentation about the water order, and once to assess the land drainage for the territorial record, and both times he stayed longer than the official business strictly required. He sat on the Dawson porch with Susan and her father and drank coffee that was more hot water than coffee given the current state of the family's provisions. And he talked with Hector Dawson about the land and the territory and the law in a way that was respectful and genuine. He asked Hector questions about the history of the property and listened to the answers with real attention, and Susan watched her father slowly relax in the presence of this man the way a man who has been braced for a blow slowly unbends when he realizes no blow is coming. On the second of those visits, Susan walked out with him to his horse when he was leaving. It was evening, and the sky was doing everything the New Mexico sky does in the evening, purpling at the edges and burning gold at the horizon, dramatic and gorgeous in the way that the landscape of that territory is dramatic and gorgeous, relentlessly and without apology. He adjusted his saddlebag and checked the girth of his saddle without mounting yet, and she stood near the fence and realized they had been standing in comfortable silence for nearly a minute, which was unusual because she was not naturally a quiet person and he seemed equally at ease with conversation. "You are leaving at the end of this month," she said. It was not a question. She had done the arithmetic. He looked at her. "The water order will be formally enforced by then. After that, my assignment here is complete. Where do you go next?" "Wherever the office sends me," he said. "There is a situation in the northern part of the territory that needs attention." "Probably after that, further east." She nodded, looking at the sky rather than at him. "Susan," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formal miss before it, and it did something quiet and significant to the quality of the air between them. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was, for perhaps the first time since she had met him, not measured or controlled or professionally composed. It was simply honest. "I am aware that my timing is," he stopped, tried again. "I am aware that you have had a difficult season, and that you have every right to not want any more complications introduced into your life right now." "Marshall," she said softly. He stopped. "I would like it very much," she said carefully, "if you did not overthink this particular part." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and with a gentleness that was entirely unexpected from a man who carried a badge and a firearm and delivered pronouncements with unmovable authority, he took her hand where it rested on the fence post. He held it carefully, like something he was not entirely sure he was allowed to have. "All right," he said. "I will try." They stood there as the sky finished its performance above Redemption Creek, and the first bats appeared in the purple air, and somewhere out in the scrub, a mockingbird began its evening inventory of every sound it had ever learned. She did not go home for another hour. They sat on the fence and talked, really talked, the way two people talk when they have decided to let each other in about his childhood in Texas. the youngest of 4 sons on a dry land farm not unlike this one, about the sequence of events that had led him to the marshal's service at 23, about the cases that had stayed with him, the ones where he had been able to make things right, and the ones where he had not managed to get there in time. She told him about her mother, who had died 4 years ago, and about the way the land had slowly changed after that, the dam going up, the water pulling back, the gradual pressure on her father that had led to the terrible Tuesday evening and the tin cup of coffee, and the arrangement that had been dismantled on a dry Thursday afternoon by a man on a dark bay horse with a badge on his vest. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you had not come," she said. "I was going to come regardless," he said. "Once I heard what was being planned, there was never a question of whether. But if you had not been in town, if you had been 50 miles away—" "Then I hope someone else would have come," he said, "but I am glad it was me." She looked at him in the last of the evening light. "So am I," she said quietly. He rode back to town that night, and she watched the darkness swallow the shape of him and the horse. And she stayed at the fence for a long time afterward, looking at the stars that were, as always, preposterously spectacular in the high desert air. And she thought about the particular strange mercy of the universe that had delivered a moment of intervention from the right direction at the right moment. Then she went inside and helped her father with the supper dishes, and when he asked what she was smiling about, she told him she was just glad about the water. He looked at her with the particular expression of fathers who are not entirely convinced and said nothing, which was its own kind of wisdom. The formal water order came through in the 3rd week of July. It was a significant document, several pages of territorial authority language that essentially informed the Calhoun family that their dam was an unlawful obstruction, and that they were required to deconstruct it within 30 days or face the territorial marshal's intervention. Marshall delivered copies personally to each of the 5 affected properties, which took him 2 full days of riding, and he arrived at the Dawson land on the 2nd afternoon with dust on his hat and a satisfaction in his expression that was deep and genuine. Hector Dawson read the document twice, looked up, and said, "I owe you more than I can say, son," in a voice that was not entirely steady. Marshall shook his hand. "Make the land good again," he said. "That is all I ask." Hector went inside to compose a written reply to the territorial office as instructed, and Marshall and Susan sat on the porch steps in the afternoon heat. She handed him a glass of water, real water, she noted, because Rosaria's son had run a bucket from a spring source not yet affected by the dam. He drank it and set the glass down between them. "When exactly do you leave?" she asked. He looked at his hands for a moment. 10 days, he said. 10 days was specific in a way that meant he had been counting. "Marshall," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not a complicated person," she said. "I am a woman who lived on this land all her life and intends to keep living on it. I am not the kind of woman who—" she paused. "I am not asking you to change anything about your life. I am not asking you anything. I just want you to know that whatever this is, it is real to me. It has been real since the morning you told me I was not part of any deal." He turned to look at her. His eyes in the afternoon light were warm and very steady. "Susan," he said, "do you think I have been riding out to this property twice a week because the paperwork required it?" She almost smiled. "I wondered about that." "The paperwork required it exactly once," he said. "Everything after that was," he searched for the word, "necessary, in a different way." "That is a very Marshall sort of way to say something romantic," she told him. He laughed, and she loved his laugh. She realized it was genuine and a little rough, and sounded like a man who did not let himself laugh often enough. "I am working on it," he said. "You do not have to work on it," she said. "I am fluent in your language already." He reached out then and tucked a strand of hair that the afternoon wind had blown across her face back behind her ear, and his fingers lingered at her jaw for just a moment, and she held very still, the way you hold still when something beautiful is close enough to touch, and you do not want to frighten it away. "I am going to be gone for several months," he said. "The Northern Territory situation will take time." After that, I do not know with certainty what comes next. I would not ask you to wait for something I cannot give you specific terms on. And yet here you are, she said quietly. And yet here I am, he agreed. She covered his hand with hers where it rested near her jaw, and they stayed that way in the afternoon light. Write to me, she said, from wherever you go, and I will write back, and we will see what the territory has in mind for us. He turned his hand under hers and held it properly. I will write, he said. I promise you that. She believed him. She was not entirely sure why she believed him so completely after such a short acquaintance, except that she had seen him deliver promises in action. The water order, the Vargas document, the moment in her father's yard when he had stood between her, and the thing she was being handed to. And she understood that for Marshall Carver, a promise was not a figure of speech, but a commitment with weight and consequence. In the 10 days before he left, they walked along the dry edge of the creek bed twice in the early evening, talking about everything and nothing in the alternating way of people who are simultaneously trying to learn as much as possible about each other, and also simply enjoy being near each other. She learned that he made good coffee, that he had read more books than she expected, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually like something that needed proper light before it would show itself, and that he was the kind of man who noticed small things. The way a shadow moved, the color of the evening sky, the particular sound the scrub made in the wind, and found them worth remarking on. He learned that she was formidably capable, and that she had an honest, unornamented way of saying things that he found deeply refreshing after years of navigating the complicated social territories of his work. He learned that she could ride as well as any man in the valley, that she had taught herself to read Spanish from Rosaria's Bible when she was 12, and that she had a habit when thinking hard about something of tracing small patterns on whatever surface was nearest to her hand, table edges, fence rails, the worn wooden armrests of the porch chairs. On the evening before he left, they stood by the fence at the edge of the Dawson property in the last of the summer evening, and the mockingbird was doing its usual inventory, and the first stars were appearing, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her very directly. I meant what I said, he told her. Every letter. I know, she said. Susan, he stopped, started again. I am saying this plainly because I do not have your gift for the indirect. I have not felt like this before, about anyone, and I am not going to pretend that is a small thing or treat it like something to be cautious about. She felt the warmth of his certainty move through her like the first water through a dry creek. Good, she said, because I have not been pretending about any of it either. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, careful and deliberate, the gesture of a man communicating something that would not fit in words, and she closed her eyes and let herself feel it properly. In the morning he was gone, heading north on the dark bay horse with the sun still low and the air still cool. She watched from the porch. He had left a letter on the fence post, sealed. She waited until noon to open it, for reasons she could not entirely explain, some instinct that she should let the leaving be complete before she began the return. The letter was 4 pages, which surprised her. He wrote clearly and precisely, and with a directness that was entirely his, and he said things in those 4 pages that she had suspected he wanted to say in person but had held back. Things about the first moment in her father's yard, about the way her laugh had surprised him that first day in the office, about the creek bed walks and the evening fence conversations, and the particular feeling he had, which he described, characteristically, with both precision and a slight gruff embarrassment, of not wanting to leave a place he had only just arrived at. She read it 3 times. Then she went inside and wrote her reply, 8 pages, because she was a more naturally voluble writer than he was and she had things to say. She sent it with the next writer to town. His reply came 14 days later, 6 pages this time. And so the months unfolded. The water returned to the valley 3 weeks after Marshall left, the Calhoun Dam dismantled under the eye of a territorial enforcement officer who came all the way from Santa Fe. The creek ran properly again for the first time in 2 years, and Susan stood at the bank and watched the water moving through its old channel, brown with the first flush of sediment and then gradually clearing, and she felt something so deep and complicated that it took her a long time to find the words for it. And when she found them, she put them in a letter to Marshall, who replied that he wished he could have been there to watch it with her. The autumn brought a good season on the Dawson land. The cattle that had survived the dry period recovered. Hector Dawson planted a winter crop with a cautious optimism that Susan had not seen in her father for several years. The Vargas family received their compensation from the territorial authority, not as much as Rosaria thought they deserved, which Susan agreed with, but something real and meaningful. The Henderson property stabilized. The valley around Redemption Creek, which had been slowly dying for 2 seasons, took a careful breath and began to be itself again. Susan worked hard. She managed the property accounts, took on correspondence work for several of the valley's less literate landowners who needed help with territorial documents, and spent the long evenings reading and writing letters that traveled north along the territorial roads by rider and by post. Marshall was in the Northern Territory dealing with a situation that he described in general terms as complicated and in specific terms as frustrating, involving a land grab by an outside business interest trying to displace a community of farmers who had been on the land for 2 generations. He was methodical and thorough about it, as she had come to expect, and he described the situation with the same clear-eyed indignation he had brought to the Calhoun water matter. She wrote back, "I begin to think that you are drawn toward situations where people are being displaced from things that are rightfully theirs, which would explain why you rode out to my father's yard on a Thursday afternoon." His reply, "I had not thought of it that way, but I believe you might be right. My mother always said I had an excess of stubbornness and a complete inability to look away from things that were not fair. She meant it as a criticism. I took it as directions." She pinned that letter to the inside of the small wooden box where she kept the most important things: her mother's cameo brooch, the water rights document, a pressed flower from the first bloom on the creek bank after the water returned. The winter was long and cold in the way of New Mexico winters, dry and brilliant and very still, the kind of cold that comes with blue skies and sharp light and frost that burned off by mid-morning. She wore her mother's wool coat and she managed the land with her father, and she waited, not passively but actively, the way you wait for something you are already building toward. He wrote in December, "I expect to be finished here by February. After that, the office has not told me where next. I find myself hoping they have forgotten about the eastern situation and will send me south." She wrote back, "I find myself hoping the same." In late January, a man she did not recognize rode into town asking questions about the Dawson property and the water rights, and word of it reached Susan through Rosaria's son within a day. The man, it turned out, was an agent from a land acquisition company out of Denver that had been gradually buying up properties in the territory wherever water access made the land valuable. The restoration of the creek had made the valley newly attractive to outside interests, and the Dawson land, with its newly restored water frontage, was apparently on a list. She wrote to Marshall immediately. His reply came 11 days later, which told her he had answered the same day her letter reached him. He gave her the name of the company, which he recognized from his Northern Territory work, the same organization that was behind the land grab he had been investigating, a pattern she had suspected but could not prove. And he told her which territorial laws applied to protect her family's deed, and what she should document, and what she should say to any agent who came to the property. He also wrote, in the final paragraph, something that made her set the letter down and pick it up again. "I have submitted a request to the office to be reassigned south when this matter concludes. I have given them several professional justifications, all of which are genuine, but I will not pretend to you that there is not a personal motivation as well. I am told February is possible. I am hoping February is possible. February was possible. He rode into Redemption Creek on the 14th of February, 1883, which neither of them acknowledged as significant until much later when it became a story they told. And he was on the same dark bay horse with the same battered hat, thinner than when he had left and with more lines around his eyes from the northern winter. And he came to the Dawson property, not the marshal's office first, which she noticed. She came out of the house at the sound of hoofbeats, because she had been expecting him for 2 days based on his last letter's projected schedule, and she stopped on the porch steps when she saw him, and he stopped the horse near the fence, and they looked at each other for a moment in the cold, bright February morning. Then she walked down the steps and across the yard, and he dismounted while she was walking, and they met at the fence, and he took her hands in both of his, and she looked at his face, the travel-worn, winter-thin, deeply familiar face of the man she had been writing to for 6 months, and something settled in her that had been slightly displaced for all of that time, like a joint returning to its proper socket. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. And then he simply held her, one hand at her back and one at her hair, and she pressed her face against the worn canvas of his coat, and felt the cold air and the warmth of him and the solid truth of his presence. They stood like that for a long time. Hector Dawson, watching from the window, cleared his throat loudly and turned back to the stove, and if there were tears in his eyes he would later say it was the cold air coming through the gap in the window frame. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Susan could remember in her adult life. Marshall was stationed in Redemption Creek, while his supervisor decided his next assignment, which turned out to require staying in the Southern Territory to monitor the land acquisition company situation that had now become a formal investigation. He worked his official duties carefully and thoroughly, as always, but he also found time, real time, unhurried time, for the Dawson property and for Susan. He helped with the winter crop assessment. He spent evenings on the porch with her father, playing cards and talking about land management and the history of the territory in a way that deepened both their understanding of things. He told her stories from the months he had been away. The northern winter, the family of farmers he had managed to help keep their land through the proper legal channels, the slow, bureaucratic battle against the Denver Acquisition Company that had ultimately produced a formal investigation. "The family you helped keep their land," she said one evening, sitting near the stove while the February wind ran along the eaves. "How old were their children?" "3 of them," he said. "Youngest was maybe 5. The oldest boy was around 12, working alongside his father like a full-grown man." He paused. They were terrified of losing the land. It was everything they had, everything their parents had left them. He was quiet for a moment. "It is the same story everywhere I have been this past year, with variations. People who have built something real being pressured out of it by people who only see the value of the land and not the value of what is already on it." "It is your story," she said. "My story. It is everyone's story in this valley." "Yes," he said, "which is why it needs more than one person to keep pushing back against it." He looked at her. "You handled the agent from Denver correctly, what you documented and what you told him. How did you know to approach it that way?" "You told me," she said, "in a letter." "You wrote very thorough letters," she said. He smiled. She had been collecting his smiles like pressed flowers all winter through the letters, and having them in person was immeasurably better. "Susan," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it plainly because you have always deserved plain speech from me, and I intend to keep earning that standard." She said nothing. She waited. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely together, and he met her eyes with the complete directness that was as much a part of him as his voice. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for longer than I knew how to say it, which is somewhat longer than I have been saying it in my head, which itself was longer than any sensible timeline would suggest given how short our in-person acquaintance has been. But I have spent 6 months writing to you and reading what you wrote back, and I know you, Susan. I know who you are, and I would like to ask you if you are willing to marry me, not because it is expected, not because it is sensible, because I want to spend the rest of my life in a place where you are." The fire crackled in the stove. The wind ran along the eaves. Somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted in the small corral. Susan looked at Marshall Carver, this man who had ridden into her father's yard on a dry afternoon, this man who had said 7 words that had changed the shape of her life, this man who had written to her through a northern winter and submitted transfer requests, and ridden 6 months' worth of thinking and feeling back to a fence post on Dawson land. And she felt the absolutely complete certainty of a person who has been making their way towards something and has arrived. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a ring simple, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, which was what this territory offered and what he had purchased in Santa Fe at a jeweler's shop 3 weeks before, which meant he had planned the question and had been carrying the ring for 3 weeks while determining the right moment, which told her everything about the kind of man he was. He put it on her finger. His hands were steady. So were hers. "I will not always be an easy man to be married to," he said. "The work takes me away. I cannot always predict where." "I know," she said. "I will not always be an easy woman to be married to. I have opinions and I will express them." "I have always considered your opinions an advantage," he said. "You are better at reading situations than most people I have met in a professional capacity." "High praise," she told him, smiling. "The highest," he said, completely seriously. And then she laughed and he pulled her toward him and kissed her properly, the way he did everything with complete attention and genuine feeling and no performance whatsoever. And she kissed him back and the stove crackled, and the wind ran along the eaves, and outside the mockingbird, who seemed to operate on no seasonal schedule whatsoever, was singing in the dark. They told Hector Dawson the next morning. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and listened to them, and then he looked at Marshall Carver for a long time with the expression of a man taking a full accounting of another person. "You are a good man," Hector said finally. "You are a better man than the one I would have traded her to." "Hector," Susan said with a weight of exasperation. "I know what I did," her father said quietly. He addressed Marshall directly. "I was desperate and I made a wrong choice. I am aware of it. I will live with it. But I want you to know that she has never, not once in her life, deserved to be treated like a transaction. And I am glad, whatever else I did badly, that something in the universe was paying attention that afternoon." Marshall said, "I was the thing in the universe that was paying attention, and I was paying attention because someone at the general store told me to." He nodded toward Susan, who looked mildly surprised. "The woman at the store who told you," she said. "Who was it?" "Mrs. Alcott," he said. "The postmistress." She said, and I remember this precisely, "There is a young woman on the Dawson property who does not deserve what is about to happen to her, and you look like a man who can do something about it." Susan put her hand over her mouth. She knew Mrs. Alcott, had known her since childhood, a small, fierce woman with silver hair who ran the post office and general correspondence service with the efficiency of a military operation and the moral certitude of someone who had very clear ideas about what was right and what was not. "I am going to visit Mrs. Alcott today," Susan said. "I think she would appreciate that," Marshall agreed. They were married in April, in the small church with the peeling paint, which had been slightly refreshed by that point, thanks to a spring painting effort organized by Rosaria Vargas, who had decided that a community event was in order and whose organizational energy, once directed toward a project, was essentially unstoppable. The wedding was attended by the Valley community, the Vargas family, the Hendersons, several families from further along the creek, the local doctor, the blacksmith, the man who ran the Iron Spur Saloon and had the good grace to change his shirt for the occasion. Mrs. Alcott sat in the front pew on the bride's side and watched the proceedings with an expression of complete satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal. Marshall stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that was the best thing he owned, which was still considerably more worn than a wedding coat ideally should be. And he watched Susan walk down the aisle in her mother's dress, altered to fit by Rosaria in the weeks before, with an expression that no one in the church that day ever forgot. It was the expression of a man who is looking at something he would walk through any amount of difficult country to reach. She reached him at the altar. He took her hand. "You look," he started. "Do not say something professional," she warned him quietly. "I was going to say extraordinary," he said. "That is acceptable," she said, and they both were smiling as the pastor began. The vows were the traditional ones, the ones that had been said in this territory and others for decades, and they said them clearly and without hesitation. And when it was done, and Marshall kissed his bride in the small church with the newly refreshed paint, the entire assembled community of Redemption Creek Valley made enough noise to be heard clearly in the scrub outside, where a pair of ravens, startled from the roof, wheeled upward into the April sky. The first year of their marriage was a good one, punctuated by Marshall's necessary absences. 2 extended trips to the Northern Territory as the land acquisition investigation reached its legal conclusion, which ultimately resulted in the formal charging of 3 company officers and the protection of the farmers' deeds, and Susan's capable management of both the Dawson property and the growing catalog of correspondence work she did for the Valley community. She was, by the time she was 23, functionally the person that half the Valley brought their official paperwork to, which she had not planned to become but had arrived at naturally through the combination of her literacy, her Spanish, and her complete inability to watch people struggle with things she could help with. When Marshall came back from the first of those trips, she had extended the porch. He stood in the yard looking at it. "I had help," she said, appearing in the doorway. "Rosaria's husband has good carpentry skills. It is larger than I expected," he said. "I thought we might need the space," she said simply. He looked at her. She met his look with the expression she had that was both entirely placid and entirely communicative, and he understood. He was inside the house before she had finished stepping back from the doorway. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, a healthy, loud boy with Marshall's dark eyes and Susan's determined jawline, whom they named Hector James Carver after her father and his eldest brother. Hector Dawson Sr., upon being told that the baby had his name, went outside to the porch and stood there for 10 minutes, which everyone in the family understood was him taking the kind of emotional moment that Hector Dawson was constitutionally unable to take in front of other people. Little Hector, as he was known to distinguish him from the elder, was the kind of baby who approached the world with a comprehensive curiosity and a complete unwillingness to sleep past 4 in the morning, which Marshall handled with a patience that surprised Susan, until she remembered that patience was simply one of the fundamental properties of his character. She watched him walking the kitchen at 5 in the morning with the baby against his shoulder, speaking quietly in the barely there voice he used when he was trying not to wake her further, and she lay in the warm bed and listened to his voice moving through the small house like a low current of water through a familiar channel, and she felt so full of love that it was almost difficult to contain. "I can hear you not sleeping," he said from the doorway. "The baby takes after you," she said. "He is never off duty." Marshall came to the doorway with the baby, who had one fist tangled in the collar of his father's shirt, and was looking at the world with the enormous dark eyes that would eventually settle into his father's exact shade. "He is currently reviewing the inventory of the ceiling beams," Marshall said, "very thoroughly." She sat up and reached for the baby, and Marshall handed him over and sat on the edge of the bed. And little Hector looked up at his mother with the wondering expression of a person encountering the best thing he had seen yet. And she touched his face and felt the specific incandescent love of a parent that she had been warned about but could not have fully understood until it arrived. Marshall leaned against the headboard beside her, one arm around her shoulders. The baby between them looked at the window where the early light was just beginning. "He is going to be remarkable," Marshall said quietly. "He already is," Susan said. Outside, the creek ran steadily in its old channel, the sound of it a constant low music in the early morning air. The land acquisition investigation concluded in the autumn of 1884 with the conviction of the company officers and the formal dissolution of their property claims in the territory. Marshall testified clearly and thoroughly, as he did everything, and his work on the case was cited by the territorial authority as instrumental in breaking the pattern that had been affecting communities across a substantial portion of New Mexico. He did not mention this to Susan. She read it in the official correspondence that came through the Redemption Creek post office, which Mrs. Alcott, with her customary attention to anything relevant to the Valley community, made sure she knew about. When she told him she had seen the citation, he looked at her with the slight discomfort of a man who genuinely does not know what to do with personal recognition and said, "The communities did the difficult part. I simply did the paperwork." "Marshall," she said. "What?" "Accept it gracefully." A pause. "I did the important paperwork," he amended. "Better," she said. He was given the option, after the investigation's conclusion, of a promotion to full marshal with a post in Santa Fe, which would have meant more authority and more stable assignment, but also a move from Redemption Creek. He came home and discussed it with Susan for 2 evenings, genuinely, fully, laying out the considerations on both sides the way he approached every difficult question. She listened to everything. Then she asked him what he wanted. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay in this valley," he said. "I know that is not the professionally ambitious answer, but I have seen enough of what happens in communities that lose the people who understand them. I know this land now. I know these people. I think there is more to do here than I have done." "Then we stay," she said simply. He accepted the deputy marshal role but arranged a formal authority agreement that gave him expanded jurisdiction over the Southern Territory, effectively the same scope he would have had from Santa Fe, but based in Redemption Creek. His supervisor, who had worked with enough deputies to recognize competence when he had it, agreed to the arrangement after 2 weeks of consideration. The second year of their marriage brought the valley through a dry spring that started badly but recovered, a brush fire in August that came within a mile of the Dawson property before a shift in the wind, and the efforts of every able-bodied person in the valley turned it, and the continued slow building of a community that was, Susan felt, more honestly itself than it had been before the water crisis had forced it to confront its own vulnerabilities. Rosaria Vargas, whose husband had returned from the mine now that their land was viable again, organized a Valley Water Committee, a formal arrangement between all the downstream landowners to monitor the creek and manage any future threats to water access collectively. Susan was on the committee and handled the official correspondence. Marshall provided legal advice when needed and attended the quarterly meetings as both an interested party and a legal resource. Eli Calhoun had, by this point, sold a substantial portion of his family's land to cover the compensation ordered by the territorial authority and relocated somewhere north, which the Valley community collectively processed with the particular satisfaction of people who have been on the wrong end of something and have watched the universe correct itself. Deke Calhoun remained in the territory and continued to be the specific kind of person he had always been, occasionally unpleasant at the Iron Spur Saloon and occasionally present at the edges of situations without being directly in them. He never approached the Dawson property or made any direct move against Marshall or Susan. He was, in the way of certain people who have been thoroughly outmaneuvered by the world, simply a diminished version of the menace he had once suggested. Little Hector learned to walk in the early spring of 1885, which he did with a determination that startled them both, hauling himself upright at 10 months and proceeding to take 7 steps before falling, then getting up and doing it again. Marshall watched this with the expression of a man whose work involves the patient, sustained effort towards something until it is achieved, and who recognizes the characteristic in a person who has been alive for less than a year. "He gets that from you," Susan told him. "The walking. The refusing to stay down." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was both pleased and a little undone, the way strong people look when they are moved by being seen accurately. "Susan," he said. "I know," she said. "You are going to say something understated, and I am going to tell you it is good." "I was going to say you are the best thing I have ever encountered," he said, which was not understated at all, and which made her cross the room and take his face in her hands. "That is exceptional," she said, and kissed him. The spring of 1885 also brought a letter from Marshall's eldest brother James in Texas, who had fallen on difficult times after a drought took his livestock, and who was asking, carefully and with visible embarrassment, whether there might be work or land opportunity in the New Mexico territory. Susan read the letter with Marshall and said, before he had time to formulate a careful response, "Tell him to come." Marshall looked at her. "There is room," she said. "The eastern section of the Dawson land has been sitting fallow since my father's health started limiting what he could manage. James knows livestock. It makes sense." "It would be for an indefinite period, Marshall," she said. "Tell him to come." James Carver arrived in June of 1885 with his wife Clara and their 3 children, and he was enough like his younger brother in the important ways, steady, hardworking, honest, and enough unlike him in the smaller ways, louder, quicker to laugh, more immediately sociable, that the household on the Dawson land became a larger and livelier thing almost immediately. Clara Carver, a practical and warm woman from East Texas, became Susan's great friend within the first 2 weeks, which surprised Susan, who had not expected to find a sister in this particular arrangement. They worked side by side, managed children side by side, and talked with the specific comfortable directness of women who have both been through enough to know what matters and what does not. Hector Dawson, who had been showing his age over the past year, seemed to revive with the Fuller house. He sat on the extended porch with his grandchild and James Carver's children in the evenings and told them stories about the land, the old days, the way the valley had been before the dam, and the way it was becoming again. Susan would listen from inside the house, through the window, and sometimes she would stop what she was doing and simply listen to his voice moving through the evening air. He had made a wrong choice, her father. He had made it in desperation, and he had known it was wrong even as he made it. He had lived with that knowledge and had slowly, steadily, done the work of earning back the respect he had compromised. He was not a perfect man, and she did not require him to be. She loved him with the complicated, full love of a daughter who has seen her parent at his worst and his best, and has decided that the whole of a person is worth more than any single part. In the autumn of 1885, Susan discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Marshall on a Friday evening, and he had the look of a man who has been given something he was not prepared for but is entirely glad to receive, and he pulled her close and held her carefully. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am excellent," she said into his shoulder. "I am also going to need help with the committee correspondence for the winter term." "I will handle it," he said, "and the porch might need to extend again," she added. He laughed, and she felt the laugh move through him and into her where she was pressed against his chest. "We will extend the porch," he agreed. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1886, a few weeks earlier than expected but strong and loud, and with Susan's precise dark eyes. They named her Margaret Ellen Carver, which Margaret would, by the time she was old enough to form opinions, find entirely appropriate and refuse to answer to anything else. She had from the first days of her life the particular quality of someone who knows exactly who she is, which everyone around her recognized and somewhat marveled at. Little Hector adored her from the beginning with the complete unconditional love of a 2-year-old who has been given the best thing anyone has ever been given, which was how he approached his sister every single day for the rest of his childhood. He brought her things. He showed her things. He explained the creek to her with absolute seriousness while she was still an infant and could not understand a word, because he understood the creek to be important and felt she should know about it as soon as possible. Marshall watched this from the porch one morning with Susan beside him, both of them holding coffee and watching their son crouch at the edge of the creek bank and point out specific features of the water to his 4-month-old sister, who was lying on a blanket and regarding the sky with great interest. "He is explaining the water rights situation," Marshall said. "He does not know what water rights are," Susan said. "He knows the creek matters," Marshall said. "He knows you protect the things that matter." "He is starting her early." She looked at her husband. He was watching their children with an expression that was entirely unguarded, that rare complete openness of a person in a moment of pure love, and she saw in his face the exact truth of what she had come to know about him over 3 years of marriage. He was a steady man. He was an honest man. He was a man who took seriously everything that deserved seriousness and who found, in the people he loved and the land around him and the work of making things right, a sufficiency of meaning that was genuine and not performed. "Marshall," she said. He turned. He saw her looking at him, and he knew she was about to say something that would matter. "I was thinking about that Thursday afternoon," she said. "The day you came." "Often," he agreed. "I think about how close it was," she said. "If you had not come, if Mrs. Alcott had not said something, if you had been a different kind of person." She paused. All the things that had to be exactly right for this, she gestured between them, toward the children, toward the land and the creek and the porch and all of it, to exist. He set down his coffee and took her hand. He held it the way he had held it that first time at the fence post, carefully, like something he was not entirely sure he was allowed to have, except that now 3 years had gone by and he was sure, he was completely sure, and the care was not uncertainty but love. "It is a long list," he said. "I try not to look at it too directly or it frightens me." "Me too," she admitted. "But it was right," he said. "Whatever the path was, it was right." The creek ran past them, clear and steady in the morning light, making its old sound in its old channel, the sound that the valley had missed and had been returned to and would not give up again. The mockingbird, on its entirely personal schedule, was going through its inventory somewhere in the brush. The children at the bank were engaged in something educational. Susan leaned against her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on their porch on their land in their valley and breathed in the same air and looked at the same world and were, without reservation or qualification, exactly where they were supposed to be. The years that built on those years were good years, with the occasional difficulty that good years always contain. A hard winter in 1887 that was overcome. A dispute with a new neighbor that Marshall resolved through patient negotiation. A season where the creek ran low and the Valley Committee was tested and held. But they were woven through with something so consistently present that Susan would sometimes pause in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and feel it directly, like sunlight on her hands. And it was simply this. The life she was living was the one she would choose, entirely and without reservation, if she were given the choice again. Little Hector started school in the fall of 1888, riding into Redemption Creek with the other children from the Valley properties, and he had his father's seriousness about things that mattered and his mother's frank manner, and Mrs. Alcott, who had started a small lending library in the back of the post office, immediately identified him as a reader and began setting books aside for him. Margaret walked at 9 months and talked at 11, and by 2 years old was conducting negotiations of her own on matters of food, bedtime, and the allocation of parental attention with a diplomatic precision that her father observed with something between pride and wariness. "She gets that from you," Marshall told Susan one evening after Margaret had successfully argued her way into an extra story before bed by pointing out that Hector had received 3 stories the previous week and that equity demanded the same. "She absolutely does," Susan agreed with no visible remorse. He smiled at her across the kitchen. She smiled back. James and Clara Carver built a proper house on the eastern section in 1889. Separating the households into their own spaces, while remaining near enough for the easy daily contact that had become the texture of all their lives. James's cattle operation on the eastern section had developed into something genuinely successful, which he was quietly proud of, and which Marshall celebrated on his behalf with the open enthusiasm that James was the more naturally expressive, and therefore had the ability to prompt in others. Hector Dawson's health declined gradually through 1889 and into 1890, the slow diminishing of an old man who has worked hard land for many years and whose body eventually presents the accounting. He spent more time on the porch and less in the field, and Susan spent more time beside him, and Marshall carried the water work and the land management with James and the men they had gradually employed from the valley community. On an October evening in 1890, Hector Dawson sat on the porch with his daughter and watched the creek in the evening light, which was doing what the New Mexico evening always did, burning and then softening, and then going to that particular shade of purple that settled over the valley like a held breath. "I am not going to see many more of those," he said. Susan said nothing. She held his hand. "I want you to know something," he said. "I want you to know that I have been ashamed of what I planned to do. I have been ashamed of it every day since. And I want you to know this, I have been so grateful every day since that it went the way it did." She looked at him. He was old and weathered and smaller than he had once been, and he was looking at the creek with the expression of a man trying to commit something to memory. "I know, Dad," she said. "The land is good now," he said. "The water is back. You are happy." "Marshall is," he paused. "He is the right person. I want you to know I see that." "I know," she said again. "And those children," he said, and his voice had something in it that was near breaking. "Those children are something." "They are," she agreed. They sat together until the stars came out, and then she brought him inside and he went to bed, and Marshall sat up with her in the kitchen and held her hand while she was quiet about things that did not need saying because he already knew them. Hector Dawson passed peacefully in November of 1890, in his own bed, on his own land, with the creek running outside his window. Susan and Marshall and the children were all in the house. Little Hector, at 6, understood something significant had happened, and was solemnly dignified about it in a way that was heartbreaking and beautiful. Margaret, at 4, held her mother's hand very seriously and said, "Grandpa is in the stars now," with the absolute certainty of a child who has been told something and believes it completely. They buried Hector Dawson on the land he had nearly given away and had instead worked to keep, under a cedar tree at the edge of the creek bank where he had often sat in his last years. The whole valley came. Mrs. Alcott brought flowers. Rosaria Vargas brought food. The Hendersons came, and the families from up the creek came, and even people from town who had known Hector in the early days when he was a younger man came and stood in the November air, and paid their respects to a man who had been imperfect and had known it and had done his best to do better. That evening, after everyone had gone, Marshall and Susan stood at the grave together in the dark. "He was a good man," Marshall said. "He was a complicated man," Susan said. "Who became a good man?" "Which is harder and more important." Marshall put his arm around her. She leaned into him, and the creek ran steadily past them, and the stars above Redemption Creek were doing their usual excessive best, and she breathed in the cold November air and the warmth of her husband beside her, and she thought about the way things end and the way things continue, and the way certain afternoons change the shape of everything that follows. The land stayed. The water stayed. The family on the land built and grew and knew itself to be exactly what it was, imperfect and complicated and deeply loved, which is the best that any gathering of people in any place at any time can honestly claim to be. Years later, when their children were older and the house had been extended twice more, and the valley community around Redemption Creek had grown to something approaching a proper town, Susan would sometimes tell the story. She would tell it to Margaret, who asked for it the way children ask for their favorite story, with a specific understanding of the shape of it, listening for the parts they already know. She would tell it to Hector, who listened with the gravity of someone who understands that the stories that made the world he lives in are worth understanding fully. She would tell them about the dry Thursday afternoon and the arrangement their grandfather had made, and the man on the dark bay horse who had ridden into the yard with a badge on his vest and an absolute certainty about what was right and what was not. And then what did he say? Margaret would ask, though she knew. He said I was not part of any deal, Susan would say. And then what happened? And then he returned the water rights to the people they belonged to, and he came back, and we had dinner on this porch and walked along the creek and wrote letters all winter. And then in February he came back and asked me to marry him. And you said yes, obviously, Margaret would say. I said yes, obviously, Susan agreed. And then we happened, Hector would add, with the particular satisfaction of a child who understands his own importance to a narrative. And then you happened, his mother confirmed, which was the best of everything. Marshall, who had usually been listening from the doorway by this point with his coffee and his quiet expression, would catch Susan's eye across the porch, and she would see in his face the same thing she always saw, the uncomplicated truth of a man who is exactly where he intended to be, in the life he chose, and that chose him back, on the land that the water had returned to, in the good evening air of the valley that had been saved one dry afternoon by the exact right person arriving at the exact right time. She would smile at him, and he would smile at her, and little Margaret would say, "Tell it again from the beginning," because the best stories always ask to be told again from the beginning, and Susan would say, "The afternoon I was nearly traded for water rights, the sky above Redemption Creek was the color of old bone." And the creek would run steadily in its channel, and the stars would begin their nightly performance, and the Carver family on the Dawson land in the valley south of Santa Fe would settle in for the telling, which was the best possible way to spend an evening, and which they did, happily and without end.